The question is that the motion be agreed. The Honourable Laurie Graham.
Thanks very much, Mr Acting President. Look, it's my pleasure to stand here today to make a short contribution on my exit from this House. It's been a fantastic opportunity for me to be here. But before doing so, I'd like to just acknowledge the people, particularly the Deputy President, the President, and the Madam President herself, who've, they've been very fair, and the way they've dealt with us all has been fantastic. And, I think it's a task that's very hard to undertake, and I know that I initially tried that chair and I found the ejection seat was the best thing for me. And I must acknowledge that the Honourable Adele Farina, who took over for me, did a much better job than I was ever likely to do. So I found my rightful place back on the backbench. So I'll start with the staff here, and look, they've been fantastic, and I would hate to pick up individual members of the staff, but they, as was commented on earlier, they all welcome you, and it's great to see them, the way they interact with us. Anthony down at the Members Lounge, he's got my mark with the coffee. I don't even these days have to suggest what I want. He's making it before I arrive, and there's a bit of humour in that, I think. I think he's, I'm terrible on names and he thinks I'll forget it every time, so I've got to look at the badge to make sure I get Anthony right. I have a number of people that I need to thank, but before doing that I want to touch on a couple of matters, and I intend to be fairly brief as I go through my contribution. On the VAD legislation, obviously I was I believe I was really unfortunate to be a member of the House during the passing of this landmark legislation, which is strong community support. Obviously, as a Catholic, it gave me some heartburn as I looked at the issue, but as I talked to all the constituents, and it was very clear that there was vast majority support for it. I think people are elected to the House to represent people. You're elected to the House also to bring your own views, but I believe that you should, wherever possible, support the views of your electorate. I was very pleased to be a party to voting for that legislation. The interesting thing is, of recent times, that legislation is about to get underway. People who weren't supportive of VAD at the time that I talked to now are wondering as to whether there should be more liberal conditions, because they've obviously looked at the recent COVID situation, what's happened in nursing homes, and lots of people don't want to go to a nursing home. I'm certainly one of them, and I'd like to think I could sign a bit of paper in advance to say, I'm out of here, but that's obviously up for a parliament in the future. When COVID arrived, and really, my 4 years went in a flash, but COVID seemed to bring it to an end much quicker than that. Everything stopped for the better part of 6 months. And, I'm in the over 70s group, and I got the phone call from my friend here to tell me that the best idea was me to be paired for the day. That was the first time legislation came to the House, and I found that difficult to accept at the time. However, in reflection, and looking what's happened elsewhere, was certainly the right decision for those of us in the more elderly group not to be here. We didn't need to be here. Everyone was going to vote for the legislation. It was a crisis that the state was trying to I suppose stop happening, as you could see it happening in other countries. And it was the Premier, acting on health advice, made some tough calls in the early days on COVID. And I remember, people lobbied all sorts of ways, particularly the business interest, to say, would you advocate for them? And I, like most, I think, were very wait and see. And it became apparent that this was the right call. Oh, and I should acknowledge the Premier in the gallery, and thanks very much for coming down, Mark. It's well done to the Premier and his team. Most people I talk to believe that there are ongoing issues until vaccination is complete. And whilst I haven't been received the jab myself, it's only because that the doctor that I was thinking was going to do it is not now having a clinic, so at the first opportunity I've asked, can I be vaccinated? I'd like to talk about committees for a while, and it's a shame the Honourable Michael Minchin isn't here, because along with the Honourable Pierre Yang and Robin Scott, we're in the most dry committee that one could be involved in, Uniform Ledge. But I think it's most probably a committee that needs to be made up of 4 solicitors, but I think they'd find it a hard time coming to any agreement. But it was great, and made, the members made what was a dull committee very enjoyable. On the Select Committee in Local Government, whilst I voted against that legislation, I was one of a number. Then I was told I'd be the deputy chair of the committee, and it was something that I'm pretty passionate about local government. I was very pleased to be given that opportunity. I was extremely disappointed that, again, COVID intervened with that reporting on that legislation, and that we didn't end up holding country hearings and do the task in a way that it should have been undertaken, but no doubt that will happen in the future. Despite cutting it short, I believe there's a number of good recommendations around the current legislation and whether it's appropriate for all local governments, and I'd like to think that we'll come up with a tiered system at some time in the future for local government. So I'm not suggesting you have A, B and C grade sort of thing, but very small local government that's got large tracts of gravel roads and nothing much else and relies on grant funding. It's not much point them doing rates of return and filling in squares and carrying on. It's much better if they went back to the old system that was in place many years ago. My hope as far as reform in local government is that local governments themselves will jump up and determine the best way to address the matter in the interest of their ratepayers. I'm sure that some of them will have problems, but every time you get close to the fence, they run back away. And it's proved unsuccessful to date, but I'm still optimistic they'll do it in the future. Council amalgamations is something I'd briefly like to talk about, because something I've been involved in, particularly at the Shire of Greenock, when we amalgamated the first time with Geraldton and Greenock. And it's, that amalgamation, I believe, was successful. Unfortunately, at that time, the rural ratepayers wanted to be part of the city. I believe the recent amalgamation into Mullawar has made that council doubtful as far as the community of interests are concerned. And perhaps at some stage, when we have reform, we'll have more logical local governments like coastal local governments, where there's community of interest on the coastal strips, and also the rural and city people who all have different views about how life should be. They're all worried about cross-subsidising the rates. I'd also take the opportunity to highlight the Geraldton election commitments. In the run-up to the 2017 election, commitments were made for $45 million for the Geraldton Health Campus upgrade, and this was subsequently increased to $90 million when it was found out that it was a much bigger job, and the ED needed to be bigger, and more beds need to be provided. And I'm very grateful to the government for committing to that and for the support that upgrade has received generally from within this House. The Step Up, Step Down facility is another one that wasn't on the radar when I was elected, and it's great to see that that facility is now up and running. So another issue that was identified quickly and got addressed. Community and sporting facilities were well received in Geraldton. Geraldton is sports mad. People in Geraldton are sports mad. When I was younger, there was a couple of thousand people playing basketball. There's only a couple of thousand today, the same number playing basketball. And I've got no doubt as facilities are improved, we will see even greater numbers participate. So the 21 commitments included the basketball commitment of $2 million, and I'm pleased to see that the association has got planning approval. I believe it's in place for through the city that will keep the costs down a little bit more than if they had got that approval later, for 4 new basketball courts. The current courts have been, as I said, unable to cope, and obviously with climate change and other things, parents aren't prepared like they were when my children were around to put them out on the outdoor courts, fall over and scratch their knees and carry on. I'd say they're a bit precious these days, some children, but however, it's a different standard. They're paying fairly big money to participate, and it's great to see that was committed. Early in 2000s, when I was in the Shire of Granite, we identified the need for boat ranches north and south, and I was very pleased to see that the government this year, after our continuing lobbying in this area, committed $3 million for coastal protection and a boat launching facility at Drummond's Cove. I believe the community will very much appreciate that, and hopefully the city can secure additional funding that they're now seeking through other sources, and build that to be a bigger and better facility, and locate it so it has the minimum impact on the residents in the area. Cycleways was another item that unexpectedly was approved this year. I know there's great drive, and in 2017 there was a report done that identified the need. I didn't think government would fund it so quickly, but committed $4.3 million. What I'd like to do is just touch on a couple of the items. I know my colleague, the Honourable Darren West, covered the other 3 electorates in the Ag region, so I'll touch only on the Geraldton ones. At the 2017 election, some of the good things, I believe, very good ones, were putting food at Food Bank, and I won't go through them all, the list is extensive. The Midwest Sports Federation for the expansion of the current cycling network, and that's the thing that resulted in that big allocation. NALA Community Services to run the youth program, and I know my colleague, the Honourable Darren West, was a driving force and put money into that in addition to our commitments from the election campaign to see that delivered in the best possible way. PCYC funding for young people with upgrading their midget vehicles that have been lying dormant for many years. That was a great contribution. I'd like to move on to the 21 commitments, and I'll just run through the list for the record. And the Geraldton Yacht Club for a rescue boat. They had one of the rescue boats need to be replaced. Geraldton Marine Sea Rescue, we provided some outdoor facilities for their generator that was rusting away in the wind. The Geraldton Bowling Club, and it was great in particular to commit to this, and it was a $30,000 project which looked to harvest water and put it back into their sump. But the beauty of that particular investment is that the club had spent most probably $50,000-$60,000 first doing all the preliminary works, and they were asked for funding to reseal the area. The Geraldton Community Toy Library was a $40,000 grant to expand that, and the Wandina Playgroup outdoor facility for playing was $50,000. Centrecare Men's Health Transportation Services, we funded a bus there, and I was there recently, and it's interesting to turn up at that facility, and Centrecare, to their credit, have funded it for the first 12 months and the coordinator, and they're taking it on for another 12 months. They obviously will continue to seek money for coordinator, but to get infrastructure to enable them to allow them to pick up the clients who are most disadvantaged in the community and bring them there. It's great to be at those sorts of facilities. Bundy Arrow was also another group that benefited from Lara's election commitments. The Quarry Street Youth Facility refurbishment was well overdue. That facility was very tired, and that was $200,000. That was great. There's a number of other commitments that I won't touch on, except for the the Hockey Association. It was great that we could make a contribution of $220,000 to the hockey. I was at Busselton the other day and watched the hockey, and obviously in the Bunbury area, and with a single turf, and the existing turf was very tired. It's obviously very difficult for sporting bodies. I know they've perhaps could it be said that they're mismanaged. They're a bit unlucky, you know. The cockatoos turned up and ate their court up and those sorts of things. So it's great to see new courts and new facilities being provided them. It's been my pleasure being a member of the House, especially with the cordial manner that members of the Chamber, all members, have treated us. I came here with some reservations, expecting to be very cliquey, and you're on this side, that side, and no one would talk to you, and it's great to see that people are very cordial. I do need to acknowledge some members in person, and I'd like to acknowledge the Leader of the House, the Hon Laurie, for, you know, putting up with us and carrying on, and yeah, we certainly test. I don't know how you do your job, and to the Leader of the Opposition in the 40th Parliament, Honourable Peter Collier, that's, you know, you always went out of your way to acknowledge us and have a chat in the corridor. It was very much appreciated, and as I said to all members of the other side. I need to comment on my friend here, the Honourable Pierre Yang. He was the whip and I was the deputy in that for that period of time. Pierre is the extraordinaire control freak, I would describe him as. He knows exactly what's going on, what everyone should be doing, and he could be out and I was doing the job and I got the message to say, you're down to 12, do something. So, yeah, it was great, Pierre, and it was my pleasure to do that task for the balance of the term. The Premier, Honourable Mark McGowan, your leadership of the party during my term has been outstanding, and no one disputes the way you have handled the COVID crisis. And I think, you know, I just don't know how, you know, you sleep at night and carry on and get up in the morning. And I know that you enjoyed the roadworks this morning as you got in, and I should comment on that, I suppose, in my comments, that like all people in regional WA now, you have to add 15 minutes to every trip because there'll be roadworks somewhere in the state, and isn't it wonderful? It'd be great when we see the majority of the big ones anyway completed, and certainly Geraldton's got 20 minutes closer to Perth as a result of the freeway extension, and another extension, and we'll be 30 minutes closer to Perth. I'll conclude my remarks by acknowledging those I've worked closest with during my term of the election campaigns, both in 2017 and 2021. And first of all, I'd like to thank the members and supporters of the Roe, Wheatbelt, Moore and Geraldton campaigns, whose hard work was a contributing factor in Labor winning the second upper house position in 2017, and this year seeing us win 3 upper house positions. Whilst I expect to have an increased vote in the seat of Geraldton, I didn't expect it by that percentage, and nor did I expect to see that the other electorates would improve by so much. So congratulations to Lara Dalton, who was elected, and also Shelley Payne and Sandra Carr, who worked very hard during the election campaign, and I'm sure the result was a reflection of the level of work you put into it. Got to move on to my friend, the Honourable Darren West. He's given me a hard time, and you would have heard him give me a hard time again the other day. It's my opinion that the success of Labor in winning the seat of Geraldton would not have been possible without the establishment of the Labor office back in Geraldton after it had ceased. And, Kim Chance was there for many years, and we had the gap, and then Darren went back. And in 2017, he put his all into the Geraldton campaign, as well as the other 3 campaigns. So he had the unfortunate position of running 4 campaigns at the 2017 election, and to get a swing in not only the Geraldton seat but also in Moore, that was fantastic. Your willingness to share the officers and staff during the past 4 years made my job much easier and helped us to better cover the 4 electorates. Leslie, I know you're here today, and thanks very much for those beds in the middle of the night where we turned up at all sorts of hours as we were driving past, and Darren invited us in for a bed. I think sometimes your son was sent out for the night to find another bed elsewhere because we'd take them all. I'd like to move on to the staff. Mark Cann was initially, I employed Mark as a temporary EO at the Geraldton office while I was waiting in office in Northam, and Mark had worked in the Geraldton office doing relief for some period and gave me a good starting, or taught me, I should say, where we were going in life. During my term, Jodie Ingram and Jeff Cannon worked as my permanent electorate staff. I was indeed fortunate to recruit you, Jeff, from the ABC as my research officer in Geraldton, and thank Darren for hosting that position for the 4 years. You quickly learnt the ropes and became a very valuable member of our team. With my decision to not seek nomination, I was concerned where the future held, but with your appointment to Lara staff, that is now secure. Jodie, who's here today as well, I was very pleased when I received your application, and I was able to appoint you to the EO position in the Northam office. With your deep involvement in the community, it facilitated the establishment of the first Labor office in Northam for many years. Your work ethic is second to none, and Darren's decision to recruit you to continue to work in that office has been a great outcome. I'd like to also extend my thanks to Barney Norton, and who provided relief in the Northam office from time to time, and Adam Dusty, who has worked in the Geraldton electorate office since the election for me when I've transferred back to Geraldton. Whilst Donna's here today, and whilst Donna Plummer and Judy Riggs both worked for Darren West, they provided support and backup not only to myself in Geraldton and Perth, but also to Jeff and Judy. I've got to say there's a number of occasions, Donna, when I said I'm going to do something and she said, no, you're not. So I did appreciate that very strict advice. Don, you're the most experienced and capable political staffer that I've ever had the pleasure to work with. Your help in Perth, country shows, and running election campaigns was fantastic. Thanks, Donna. Judy Riggs assisted me greatly in my role, especially in the Geraldton area, where she looked after all of my commitments there. Judy's compassion for helping constituents, especially those most disadvantaged, is amazing. I've never struck an electorate officer who can have someone at the counter going ape, and Judy sits there and patiently talks to them and talks them down, finds out what their problem is and endeavours to solve it. She's an amazing lady, and Laurie, you're very lucky to have her on your staff. I've left Lara till last in the staff because I've got to thank Lara for, obviously in 2017 she achieved a remarkable swing, fell short by a small margin herself. I was very lucky that that big swing, together with the more increased vote, saw me elected and Labor get, as I said, 2 positions for the first time. You gave it all again to your campaign, and the massive swing this year was largely your own efforts. I'm sure you'll continue to be a great advocate for the people of Geraldton and the broader Midwest community, and be able to hold the seat for an extended period of time. Last by no means least, I would like to acknowledge and thank my family for embracing my decision to seek endorsement in 2017 and the impact it's had on them. I was in retirement mode and things all changed. After I ran in 1996 for the seat of Geraldton, an election where Labor had little chance of winning, I made a commitment in 1997 that I would not stand as a political candidate again. However, I negotiated approval with my wife, the boss, to be on the ag ticket in 2017. In doing so, I gave her the assurance that whilst I may assist Laura in winning the seat of Geraldton by being on the ticket, the chances of me being elected were very remote. History says otherwise. I know Darren and other members, Ian Blaney, saw it coming, but I certainly didn't. While on the family, I'd like to special thanks to my daughter Stacey, who I've stayed with for the last 4 years and disrupted her family life. I'm sure she'll not miss my impact on the family, as I came and went at all hours of the day and night, and she accommodated my ever-changing arrangements and always produced a meal on the table whenever I arrived unexpectedly. I'm sure my wife Heather will wish I was back here again after I'm under her feet for an extended period of time. I think the new dog Rain will appreciate having me home, however, and maybe the veggie garden will flourish again. Members, I've got no definite plans for the future work, or community involvement, but I will continue to remain involved in organisations like JobLink Midwest as long as they want me, and several parties have expressed an interest in me taking some active part to assist them in their projects. Mr Acting President, it's been fantastic 4 years, and thank you one and all.
Thank you for your service, the Honourable Laurie Graham, and all the best for the future.